Welcome everyone to Fall for the Book. My name is Amaka Okachukwu. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at George Mason, and I'm going to be moderating the event today. Today we have a treat. We have Blake Silver here to talk about his recent book, The Cost of Inclusion: How Student Conformity Leads to Inequality on College Campuses. Blake Silver is an assistant professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at George Mason. And he is also the director of data analytics and assessment in the Honors College at George Mason. He received a PhD in sociology from the University of Virginia, where he was a Jefferson Fellow. So I'm actually just going to hand it off to Blake. We should have plenty of time to hear his remarks and have plenty of time for questions. And so I look forward.
All right. Thanks, Amaka. And I figured I'd start by saying thanks to everyone who's taking the time to tune in today for this event. And of course, a big thank you to Fall for the Book and the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at George Mason for hosting us. In addition to kind of saying a few words about the findings that I describe in the book, I thought I'd begin with a few introductory remarks that situate this research in some of the literature that it's been in conversation with. And so I began thinking about this study in the framework of a broader kind of engagement with inequality and higher education. And in the sociology of higher education historically, we've done a lot of thinking about inequality as it comes to questions of access to colleges and universities, and questions about degree completion, graduation, and college outcomes. And it was really within the past decade or so that sociologists started to ask questions and explore possibilities as they related to students' experiences on college campuses. And part of that work involved thinking about how college students sort themselves and are sorted into various opportunities, various kinds of spaces for involvement and college engagement. And so when I started thinking about this book, I really thought about it as a way not just to kind of build on conversations of access to higher education, but to build on these conversations about how students arrive in social and extracurricular opportunities by asking a question about what kinds of experiences students were having within those communities as they build social groups, as they try to find a space to be included and to belong within higher education. And so in that process, I decided I really wanted to be able to have an inside look at the kinds of communities that students were building for themselves in higher education. And I thought about doing that through an ethnographic study that brought me as a participant observer into uh, into a college campus, and in particular, not just sort of observing and understanding that campus writ large, but being able to really zoom in on a more micro level to look at the experiences students were having within three specific extracurricular outlets. And those were a cardio club, which was a club sports team that was focused on intercollegiate competition and cardio fitness, a volunteer collective, which was a registered student organization that was focused on community service, and then finally a learning community, which was a residential community that was formed around the theme of social justice. And joining and becoming parts of those groups in many ways allowed me to have a semblance of the contemporary college experience, and to be able to see the ways that students were engaging and interacting with one another in social spaces. Now, in addition to seeing what was happening on the ground, it became clear to me that if I wanted to understand these communities in a more comprehensive way, I also needed to be able to understand the ways that students were perceiving their involvement in those spaces and kind of their socio emotional experiences in those outlets. And so, in addition to a year of ethnographic observation, I also conducted 80 in depth interviews with first year college students. And in those interviews, I was able to ask questions about their experiences in not just the three extracurricular groups I observed, but in a whole range of campus social spaces. Um, and one of the things that came out there was a sort of predominant logic for engaging in social and extracurricular groups. Um, and what I mean by this is we could think about all the reasons that students might become involved in these settings, including, given the sort of dominance of career preparation and economic opportunity as a motivating factor in pursuing higher education, we might have hypothesized that something like career preparation would be an important part of this, that perhaps students get involved on campus in order to build their social networks, in order to develop resumes that will be advantageous when applying for jobs, or perhaps to kind of hone and craft particular skill sets that could be useful in the labor market. And despite all those possibilities, the thing that came out across these interviews in a powerful way was a description from students of the ways that they were pursuing social and extracurricular involvement as a way to find a place to belong in college. Um, what became clear, however, in both the observational and interview components of the research was that not all students had the same experiences finding belonging in extracurricular outlets. And I think I should perhaps say a word about what that looked like and give a few examples. So, one of the students who I met and interviewed was a Latino man named Tom, who became involved in several groups on campus, some social and extracurricular outlets. Tom was extroverted and outgoing, and he was eager to get involved. And like other students, Tom described involvement as a way to find a social niche, a way to find a place to fit in and to belong. And nonetheless, when we arrived at the end of the interview, and I reached the question that I asked all students about a time when they felt like they belonged or were included in a social group, Tom's response surprised me in a lot of ways. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he responded and said that he had not yet found a place that he felt like he belonged on campus, and he hadn't yet found somewhere that felt like home. And I say that was surprising in part because of how eagerly Tom had pursued involvement in college, and in many ways he had done all the right things. He had followed prescriptive advice that universities give to get involved and to look for friends on campus. And yet, Tom and many other of the women and racial and ethnic minority students who I interviewed described feeling like they came up empty handed in that quest for inclusion and belonging. And that feeling, that experience, contrasted sharply with the experiences of white men in these same groups and settings. And when I interviewed many white men, they described feeling a sense that they kind of fit in everywhere and that they belonged in a whole range of social settings. And that experience gave them a much more durable sense of inclusion in higher education, a sense of being able to belong over time in a really consistent way. And so, what became clear in these interviews and observations is that there were stark inequalities between women and racial and ethnic minority students and their white male peers in terms of who was able to develop and continue to feel a sense of inclusion. And in the book, I try to unpack not just disparities in these socio emotional experiences, but the process that produced those disparities. And one of the concepts that I introduce in order to describe that process is the cookie cutter self. And in the first part of the book, I show what the cookie cutter self is, and I try to unpack this idea. But to sum it up in a fairly brief way, a cookie cutter self was a set of simplistic, two dimensional identities, styles of self presentation that students took on when they were entering new communities and new groups in order to feel like they would fit in those spaces. Um, and these identities focused on a sort of narrow and very specific contribution to their peers and social groups. And there were five main types. The first of them was the manager cookie cutter self. Managers were the students who took charge in social groups. They were colloquially referred to as planners or leaders. Um, there were educators who worked to convey knowledge and ideas to others, in essence, to be intellectuals in their communities. The third version of the cookie cutter self was the entertainers. Entertainers told jokes, they pulled pranks, they worked to provide diversion to other students. And by contrast, the fourth style was students who I call associates. They were quiet followers who were reserved but compliant in group settings and sort of went along with the general flow of group activity. And then finally, a group of students who I refer to as the caregivers work to present as kind and supportive and to be nurturing to other students. And I'll give an example actually of this last version because it came from a white woman named Jamie, who was a member of the learning community. And Jamie was someone who, from the very first days in that community as a first semester, first year student, she took on this style of self presentation that focused on looking out for those around her, providing all kinds of support to them. When I interviewed Jamie in the spring semester, she described herself as the mom of the group. And she talked about the ways in which she worked to provide that kind of care for peers. She, at one point during the interview, opened her handbag and pulled out a bottle of Tylenol, a package of Band Aids, a pair of flats of extra shoes, Benadryl. I mean, she had this whole assortment of items that were meant to demonstrate the ways in which she cared for others, both physically and emotionally. And when other students in the community spoke about Jamie, they used these same descriptors. They talked about how kind and nice and caring she was. And what became clear was that Jamie and her peers described this caring style in a very limited way. Jamie was not also described as smart or funny or as a leader or an intellectual. She was described and described herself as exclusively focused on caring. And so, why did this matter? Well, I think there's a whole range of reasons that we ought to be concerned by this kind of pattern. But perhaps most central for the book and for the findings that I present here, um, these different variations of cookie cutter identities related to different levels of feeling included or feeling belonging. And so, in addition, these cookie cutter selves were not equally available to all students. They couldn't sort of select them from a menu of options. Instead, they related to assumptions and stereotypes about the intersections of race and gender. So that, for example, you may have gained from the example of Jamie, caregivers in virtually all cases identified as women. Associates were often students of color and women. And managers and educators were often white men. And so, what this meant was that these different roles that were couched in stereotypes and expectations of peers were linked to different levels of value in a way that it started to explain that disparity that I was describing earlier in the ways that students felt included or belonging, or conversely, in the ways that they felt liminal or marginalized in these social and extracurricular settings. And that inequality um, persisted throughout the course of the research. And the second concept that I wanted to introduce before we open things up to questions is that of role inertia. And in the second half of the book, I describe role inertia as an explanation for how and why these disparities in socio emotional experiences persisted over time. Um, and we could think about this in a few ways. So we might have imagined that perhaps students took on cookie cutter selves when they were arriving in groups in order to demonstrate initially among a new set of peers that they fit in. But perhaps over time, they might have evolved and changed in certain ways. And that possibility of change certainly fits with narratives that we have about higher education as a place for growth and development. And so as I was conducting this research, I remember sort of early on holding out hope for the possibility that over time students would be able to resist, to deconstruct, to move past these cookie cutter styles into something more nuanced, more complex, and perhaps a more holistic sense of who these young people were. But there were social forces that worked against that kind of change. And in particular, there were two that propped up the pattern of role inertia that I describe in the book. The first was positive reinforcement. And so the student who I mentioned earlier, Jamie, when presenting as a caregiver, was often acknowledged by peers with expressions of gratitude. She described not just conversations, but also tangible evidence of this kind of gratitude, including thank you notes that she had received from peers who she cared for when they were sick, a gift that she was given by a peer who she sort of looked out for during a tough time. And those markers of appreciation serve to perpetuate students' styles of self presentation. For students who are performing in the ways that conformed with expectations of peers, the function of positive reinforcement was to create a sense that perhaps this role was or could be fulfilling, and in some ways locked students into those cookie cutter styles. Conversely, behavioral policing was the other side of this coin. It was the other element of role inertia. And so, even for students who made real attempts to self present in more complex ways, or in ways that sort of broke out of those initial cookie cutter styles, the policing and negative sanctions of peers proved to be a powerful motivator for returning to the initial presentation of a cookie cutter self. So there was another student in the learning community, a Black woman named Rhonda, who performed as a caregiver in ways that were virtually identical to Jamie's self presentation. And like Jamie, she adopted this role early on in the fall semester and performed in a really consistent way for about 8 or 9 weeks. And then early in November, there was a group meeting that I witnessed where Rhonda momentarily sort of dropped the traditional markers of the caregiver style and lectured her peers, shared some knowledge and insight that she had with others in the group. And her style in that moment was similar to white male students in the same exact group who often embodied that educator role and acted as intellectuals and worked on kind of distributing knowledge, information, and insight. But Rhonda's peers did not respond in the same way to her that they did to those young white men. Instead, she encountered this sort of sudden and I could tell from Rhonda's reaction, unexpected marginalization as a result of this moment, where for several weeks following the meeting, students were reluctant to sit with Rhonda, talk with Rhonda. In many ways, she was ostracized in that group for a period of time. And in order to sort of return to a sense of rapport with peers, Rhonda had to also return to that initial caregiver style of self presentation. And she had to work hard in the following weeks to demonstrate to others that she was, in fact, caring and kind and supportive. And in the process, she had to move away from those um, manifestations of self presentation that were about sharing knowledge and insight. And, and Rhonda actually became very reflexive about this moment and about this broader pattern. And I wanted to share one of her quotes that she articulated because I think it sums up this sense in a really clear way. Rhonda said, "quote, I'm educated, but I'm scared to speak up because I'm caring, but I know when I talk to people, when I tell them something, they see me as an angry black person. I don't want them to see me that way. So a lot of the time I try not to say anything. I'm still struggling with that. I struggle with it every day." And so, what became clear in this quote from Rhonda and from other students as well was that stereotypes and controlling images were leveraged to lock students into styles of self presentation that conformed with their peers' assumptions about the intersections of race and gender. And in the end, these disparities in belonging and inclusion were in a lot of ways about the demands placed on self presentation and identity in social and extracurricular outlets, so that students like Rhonda and Jamie became locked into styles of self presentation that were not always fulfilling and that could not always provide the sense of inclusion that many of their white male peers had access to. And so these are two concepts, again, that I think begin to shed light on both the production and the reproduction of inequality in social and extracurricular outlets. And I think in some ways complicate many of the traditional narratives about what college is as a space for growth and development, and also about what it means to be involved and what the outcomes of that involvement might be. And so I want to pause my remarks here for a moment and open things up for questions from our audience, for thoughts and queries.
Thank you so much, Blake. As the questions come in, I can start off with some questions of my own. And I'm sure we'll have lots of great questions. But I wondered what thoughts you had about the implications of your findings for after college, right? Like in some ways, right, college is this kind of gateway into adulthood. It's this sort of like liminal space before you're like a real adult, right? But so much about how young people learn about um, your networks, how you're interacting with people, the people that you meet, right? Some of these people you've been connected to for a long time. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about, these sort of um, these cookie cutter selves and like being locked in these particular um, presentations of self and like what implications that might have for when students leave the university setting.
Yeah, I do. And in fact, I think that the point of transition out of college and into post baccalaureate life is a really interesting moment to think about some of the consequences of these findings. In part because some of the most immediately obvious implications, again, about belonging and inclusion, can have really sort of near term effects in terms of whether or not students persist in college, retention to degree completion.
Right.
I think the question of what happens after college is really important here as well. And in the book, I suggest that the way that higher education positions itself as a space for students to grow and develop as not just individuals and not just to be career ready, but to be members of a diverse democratic society has a lot of implications for the ways in which students' identities and the ways that they learn to build community might persist and have effects after graduation. And so, for instance, I think one of the troubling things here is that we often describe social and extracurricular involvement as a pathway for learning about leadership, what leadership looks like, how to perform leadership, and how to be a successful leader. And I think what was clear in these groups is, first of all, that the things we might look at and sort of in a traditional kind of two-dimensional way identify as leadership were reserved for a small group of students. Again, sort of white men were most frequently taking on these styles. And yet, I think even the version of leadership that was common among those white men is perhaps not the version of leadership that we would intentionally seek to cultivate as post-secondary institutions. I think we hope and aspire to create leaders who um, don't just give orders, but are able to listen and be empathetic and humor and to see possibility and to draw from knowledge and research and inform practice in those ways. And I think those kinds of versatile dynamic styles of leadership were not things that students seem to be cultivating in these spaces, in part because being beholden to these stereotypes often meant that for some students, authority was inaccessible. And for those for whom authority was accessible, leadership often became a very limited and kind of two-dimensional exercise. And so I think as students are moving out of college, we really see why all of these things become so crucial and important. And I sort of hope that that a revision to what existing practice in higher education looks like might also have the potential to produce more successful and engaged citizens in our society.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it strikes me that this isn't so much of a question, but it just strikes me that so much of the sort of the gendered and racialized implications that you sort of bring forth here in regards to some of these cookie cutter selves, the implications that have for like social capital, um, particularly after college. So much of the discourse around attending college is not just about education in the book learning sense, but it's about your ability to extend and expand your networks, and those networks being spaces of opportunity, right? And so, what does it mean that folks are unable to fully participate or be sort of have a full access to a full range of selves, essentially, in the university setting? What that means for locking folks into a particular way of behavior, but also expectation, um, right, in the workplace, or I mean, even in the home, right? Sort of, so I'm just sort of, responding to some of what you've presented. Um, I just find that to be really interesting. Um, I'm wondering currently, right? We are in this moment where so many folks are virtual, right? In terms of universities, even though I think there's this sort of hybrid thing where the dorms are full, but people are taking online classes, right? So that's another thing as well. But I'm wondering your thoughts about, in terms of the takeaways for the book and in, and sort of in relationship to this sort of brave new world that we're in, with the predominance of virtual ways of learning because of COVID-19 and our attempts to be safe. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about um, the implications of the book for this specific COVID moment and the sort of state of universities today.
Yeah, absolutely. I've thought about that in a few ways. I mean, on the most basic level, I'm really curious about how these dynamics are shaping the ways that students are engaging with one another. And I think this would be an area that would be just really fruitful for more research and greater understanding. But some of the things I kind of suspect and hypothesize based on what we know about disruption and uncertainty, like the moment we're in, is that often that kind of environment amplifies existing inequalities. And so I think it's certainly possible that a social environment that's constructed in part or in large part even around virtual platforms for engagement um, might further constrain self-presentation and might further amplify those disparities in belonging and inclusion. Likewise, I think there become all sorts of other questions about ownership over space in virtual settings and kind of who has the authority to speak, who has the authority to kind of take up virtual space. And so, yeah, I think in many ways, the insights of this book that, something like a small gesture that we might, often as faculty and staff, practitioners, parents, community members, that we might sort of overlook or dismiss, those small gestures were incredibly meaningful to students. And so the possibility that an eye roll over a Zoom call could be just sort of the kind of crushing blow to someone's sense of self or sense of being included in a virtual setting that it can be in a in-person face-to-face setting is made possible now by the fact that so many of these platforms are including video feed um, and sort of creating quite literally sort of two-dimensional peers with whom one um, is instructed to engage.
Mm-hmm. Um, yeah, I mean, I'm thinking a lot about this in relationship to, we know courses are online, but I'm assuming that the social life to some extent has had to also move online, like clubs still meeting, is that happening virtually and that kind of thing. And I'm wondering how, the possibility for your work to perhaps dovetail with some of the work done on sort of online identities and that kind of thing, right? Because,
Yeah,
in some ways, right, very different in the sense of online identities, I think emerge from a place of essentially on anonymity. And so you can kind of, in terms of fashioning a self, it's a different process. But I'm wondering if there's some overlap or some interesting intersections there, right? Thinking about this.
yeah.
So we have one question from the audience. The question is, have you noticed patterns for students with disabilities? Specifically because some students with disabilities may have hidden disabilities and stereotypes will not be activated until someone discloses their disability.
Yeah, so in the book, one of the things that I describe is the ways in which the kind of institutional setting that I was exploring and the types of groups I was involved with were quite diverse in many ways and included students, not just students of color and students who identified with a range of gender identities, but also students who were disabled students, international students, LGBTQ students, students who were undocumented, and students who spoke a whole range of languages. And what I note in the book is that while the stereotypes that students drew on about the intersections of race and gender became sort of front and center in many ways in the identity strategies that students were adopting, that it's very possible that in certain kinds of social and extracurricular settings or at certain types of institutions, meanings about identity and self-presentation might relate more closely to other sociodemographic characteristics and to other important intersections. And so I think the question about, how students with disabilities might experience these kinds of social settings and how a whole range of students with other intersectional identities might find possibilities for inclusion and belonging in these settings is something that is still very much open to exploration. And I think, and I hope that this will be a sort of jumping off point for future comparative research across universities. And I hope across groups that are both diverse, non identity based extracurricular outlets, but also those that are connected with a particular identity or a particular lived experience. And so I'm excited to see more of what we find there in the coming years.
Okay, we have another question. Given the initiatives in higher education to promote diversity, education, and inclusion, I seldom hear about how to work with the student that is afraid to participate because of political affiliation. Imagine
Mhm.
any student of any race, gender, religion, etc., that does not want to conform politically with the majority. How would you assist a student feeling that way?
This is a really good question because, one of the things that I alluded to at the beginning was the way that this research kind of focused in on students' experiences once they were within a particular social or extracurricular group. But some of my other research has looked at how to find and identify groups, as well as sometimes how students leave groups. And in some of that research, I've written about things like political identity and affiliation, about the impact of being a first generation or less socioeconomically advantaged college student. And I think these types of identities and lived experiences become really influential when we think about how students are seeking out places to become engaged and involved, as well as when they're making a decision about whether they'll remain in a particular setting. And I think the possibility here, I think the sort of hopeful moment, because as a sociologist, I'm always looking for the hopeful moment in findings that are often um, not always sort of optimistic and hopeful. But I think a possibility here that would extend to questions of political identity, to questions of the experiences of first generation, low income, and working class college students, and other socio-demographic groups, including in improving and sort of enhancing opportunities to belong for women and students of color, would be to think about how we, and when I say we here, I mean faculty, administrators, staff, and student affairs professionals, build environments for students to engage. And I think that work needs to happen in a more strategic and intentional way. I think too often in higher education, we say, we'll create the space for students to engage across vectors of diversity and difference, but we won't give students the tools to have that engagement and to build communities in productive ways. And what I mean by that is that many students are coming to college with a whole range of experiences in K 12 school settings, in neighborhoods and communities. And one of the things we know is that many of those settings are homogeneous in terms of race and ethnicity, social class, political affiliation, and so on. And so students who arrive in college haven't necessarily had a lot of experiences interacting with and building communities with others who differ from them on those socio-demographic characteristics. The possibility here is, I think, for faculty and staff to become more engaged in those settings, to join them and to try to set models for for students to think about how to interact with one another without resorting to stereotypes, and perhaps to this question here, how to build communities that aren't exclusive based on political affiliation or based on a whole other host of socio-demographic and identity-based characteristics. But I think that requires us to be much more proactive than we've historically been in higher education, and to really meet students halfway. Again, students like Tom, Jamie, Rhonda were so excited to be in college and to be getting involved in this way. Um, I think for many students, the involvement of faculty and staff in these communities and in providing students with concepts and tools to build them would be much appreciated.
Great. Okay, so we have one last question from the audience, and it states, do you believe that taking on all of the cookie cutter identities, or at least having a foundation of these identities, bring the best out of a leader in social groups?
So in the final chapter of the book, I had the opportunity to explore the experiences of 6 students who, out of the 158 who were involved in some aspect of this study, these 6 students I identified as presenting in complex, sort of non traditional, versatile, and dynamic ways in social groups. The 6 of them did not take on any one of these cookie cutter identities. In fact, uh, they were strategic and intentional about presenting in ways that to this question that mixed care and authority with intellect and humor and the ability to listen and to follow at times and so many more characteristics as well. And in the final chapter, I tried to unpack what it was about those students' experiences that gave them the ability to build those more complex identities. And again, I think that's one of the really hopeful moments in this book because the very short kind of teaser version of this that I'll offer here is these students found resources on campus that they were able to use to think about themselves and who they wanted to be, as well as the ways that others around them would perceive them and the assumptions that others might make about them, all in order to inform a version of identity, a style of self presentation that they felt sort of matched their authentic self, the version of self that they wanted to create. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Blake. Is there any last remarks you would like to make before we close the event?
No, I just wanted to say thank you again to everyone for joining us and thank you, Amaka, for being our host today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. I will co-sign that. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Please go buy Blake's book, The Cost of Inclusion, University of Chicago Press. Adopt it to your courses. Reach out to him for talks. Yeah, just continue to engage this important book. Please visit the Fall for the Book website to get any information on past or future events and anything on the authors and the books that they are here discussing. And thank you again for attending this event. Have a great day and read on.